Welcome to the podcast Stolen Science. My name is Dr. Daryl Racine, and this podcast details Indigenous contributions to Western European science and culture, primarily in Western Canada. Following from the previous podcast, we're now going to look at the Captain Back expedition of 1833. The next expedition to visit the Mackenzie River District was led by Captain Back, who had served Franklin on both his first and second expeditions. Back's 1833 overland expedition was an attempt to find and rescue a naval officer, or he was actually retired at the time, John Ross, who had sailed into the Arctic on a privately funded expedition to find the Northwest Passage and who had been missing since 1829. Back's mission was twofold. First, to find and assist John Ross, and second, to explore the Arctic coast and carry out scientific observations. With respects to the second point, Dr. Richard King was assigned to the expedition as a surgeon and a naturalist. Very little is known about Richard King, but there is some indication that he attended St. Andrews University in Fife, Scotland, and was awarded a medical degree in 1832. So he must have just graduated from medical school and then ends up on the expedition. Probably knew someone. King later in life would go on to establish the Ethnological Society of London and later help establish the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain. This is going to be important, or King is going to become a lot more important in latter podcasts because he is one of the founding members of the Ethnological Society, but he's one of those founding members of anthropology too. And when we look at the origins of anthropology, what we're going to find is that Western Canada, or that geographical area, what was happening with the Hudson's Bay Company and science, was in a sense a foundation that actually created the study of anthropology. But that's for a later podcast, but I think it's important to note now that King does become more important later in latter podcasts. Back set out on his expedition in February 1833 and was subsequently informed in April of 1834 that Ross had been rescued. Upon the reception of this news, the secondary objective of scientific observation became the primary objective of the expedition. The Hudson's Bay Company's support of Back's expedition was significant. The Hudson's Bay Company offered assistance included 120 bags of pemmican, 2 boats, 2 canoes, as well as the assistance of the company officers and clerks. The expedition was taken very seriously by the Hudson's Bay Company, as governor and deputy governor of the Hudson's Bay Company sat on the committee presiding over the expedition. It should also be noted that several members of the Royal Society, as well as some of the most important naval men of their time, sat on this committee. Although we may assume that the company's motives were altruistic in that they had a general concern for John Ross, we should also presume that the company was well aware of the public support of this expedition and had already benefited from the popularity of the Franklin expeditions in the form of political support for their charter renewal. And just to review, that charter was about having a monopoly in northwestern North America over the fur trade so that no other company could actually impede on their territory, or at least that's how the Hudson's Bay Company thought of it. Now, they did have rivals, the Northwest Company, and they certainly didn't believe that charter applied to them. They end up in conflict, but in the end, the companies actually amalgamate in 1821, and it just becomes the Hudson's Bay Company itself. And then they truly do have a monopoly. Senior officers of the company also benefited from the expedition both politically and socially. In a letter to officers of the company, inland governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, George Simpson, enticed them to participate through promises of promotion and increases in salary. Simpson writes, and I quote, "And as an encouragement to enter on this dangerous service, we hereby assure you, Alexander Roderick MacLeod, or to you, Simon McGivery, our warmest support towards early promotion to a chief factorship in the event of either embarking on the enterprise or rendering to Captain Back such valuable services as we consider you qualified to afford, and to Mr. John MacLeod or Murdoch McPherson, we hereby promise our warmest support towards early promotion to chief tradership in the event of either embarking on this enterprise, rendering in like manner to Captain Back such valuable service as we consider you capable of affording. Besides an increase in salary of £100 per annum, that's about $27,000 today. So they get an increase in their pay if they assist for the time you may be employed on this expedition. This is important because what we're starting to see is that the company officers are going to start valuing working with science, supporting science, because they understand that if they do, they get a raise in pay, they get promotions. So it becomes a focus of many of these officers to assist as much as possible to ensure, well, that they're going to get paid more, that they're going to get promoted. And this is really important because as we move through time, this becomes a practice of the Hudson's Bay Company. And what you have to, I guess I'm going back to a previous episode, but you have to understand that renewal of that charter, that monopoly that Hudson's Bay Company had, the renewal of that was dependent on whether or not their charter was supported in the Parliament. And in order to get, to be supported within Parliament, you had to have the British population to support that idea also. So when you did one of these Arctic expeditions and you created a narrative that was sold to the public and those explorers become famous, then the Hudson's Bay Company's name becomes more famous, and therefore the likelihood of charter renewal is more likely. Indigenous people figured prominently in working for and supporting Back during his travels. Back indicate that his crew consisted of 20 individuals, 5 of whom can be identified as Indigenous, 3 Six Nations, and 2 Métis. Back also hires First Nations people to haul the expedition's food and supplies, as well as for the purpose of hunting. Acaccio, who we had talked about in a previous episode, who had assisted Franklin, he had hunted and guided for Franklin on the first 2 expeditions, and who knew Back, of course then, was hired to hunt and guide. The importance of Acaccio to Back's expedition was clear when the expedition was close to starvation. Back reports, during the appalling period of suffering and calamity, Acaccio proved himself the firm friend of the expedition. The dawn of each morning saw him prepare for the hunt, and aware of the heavy pressure of that distress which, though he could not altogether avert, it might be in his power to mitigate, he boldly encountered every difficulty and made others act by force of his example. The records do attest to some of the mixed ancestry assistance to the cause, or Métis. You can insert Métis there. The reason I use mixed ancestry, and I think it's really important, is because that term was not being used in the Arctic at that time. Yes, they were well aware, but the term Métis really doesn't start to come through in the expeditions and the narratives and what's going on until about 1850 or so. So I use mixed ancestry just for academic reasons, but I think that it's easily asserted that Métis, because if you would have been in Red River and asked who these people were, they probably would have said that they were Métis, probably, maybe not, by 1850. At Fort Resolution, Back needed information about the geography beyond the Great Slave Lake and turned to a Métis by the name of Laprise to assist in drawing a map. Laprise, it would seem, was familiar with cartography or map making from his experience with the first Franklin expedition, as well as Samuel Back. He was another officer that was down in the Rocky Mountains, what would be southern Alberta, northern Montana at that particular time. He had been with Samuel Back on his expedition, what we're referring to as the Columbia District, which we will talk about in a later podcast. Back conveys his pleasure upon discovering the assistant's skill. Quote, Laprise, who had been subjected to similar questioning by his friend Sir John Franklin in 1820, at once understood me and pointed to the compass as an instrument which he was well acquainted. Having been placed right over it, he pointed his hand in the direction of the places required, while I carefully noted their magnetic bearing, and it is but justice to state that the whole of his description was subsequently found to be remarkably correct. My point here is that by 1833, what we have people of Indigenous ancestry that understand the equipment that is being used in science, and that they know how to manipulate that information and assist expeditions. Another Métis, Le Camarade de Manderville, who was chief of the Dog Rib First Nation. And Dog Rib, I shouldn't actually be saying Dog Rib, I should be saying the actual designation by which those Dene call themselves. Also assisted back in King. De Manderville and his wife had assisted Franklin on the second overland expedition as guides and interpreters. Another Métis, Le Camarade, who was chief of a Dene First Nation, also assisted back in King. Camarade and his wife had assisted Franklin in the second overland expedition as guides and interpreters. Camarade assisted the expedition not only by supplying meat over the winter, but also providing geographical information. King noted that Alexander Roderick MacLeod collected information from Camarade's people. He then suggests the significance of their knowledge. Quote, "The information which Mr. MacLeod had collected was then explained and made more intelligible by means of an outline of the northeastern country drawn by the Camarade. The rude map represented the great fish and fish rivers maintaining a nearly parallel direction." Unquote. Métis people such as Laprise and Camarade, who had experience with assisting expeditions, were essential in providing indigenous knowledge in the form of geographical information and interpretive services to Back and others. So again, this just kind of restates the fact that indigenous people were getting used to science, that they enjoyed working for science. And as we'll get other examples, is that they were paid much more by men of science or scientific expeditions than they were being paid by the Hudson's Bay Company for anything that they might do for them, such as the general fur trade, like getting beaver skins and so on and so forth. Another example of collecting on King's return trip to York Factory occurred at Norway House, where he met Chief Factor Peter Warren Dease. While visiting with Dease in his tent, and I think that Dease, you can look at the academic writing here in regards to the history of Dease. I think I have to go with William Barr. I think he suggests that Dease was of mixed ancestry, and I think he was from other research that I did. While visiting with Dease in his tent, King would reacquire an example of a marmot lost at Portage La Loche. That's in northern Saskatchewan today. King relates the story as follows. While bewailing this loss in my family tent of Mr. Dease, the gentleman who accompanied Sir John Franklin in the second expedition, his daughter, a very interesting Michif child, retired for a moment and returned with a little pet of the same species in her arms, at once put an end to my lamentations by the gift of an animal which until then I was perfectly ignorant she possessed. This was not only important as increasing my chances of conveying a live specimen to England, but as tending to throw some light upon the sex of the creature previously involved in much obscurity, and it is still a matter of doubt which of the two is lord and master. These animals were subsequently presented to the Zoological Society with an intimation that they were probably new to naturalists. Peter Warren Dease nor his daughter were credited with this discovery of this subspecies of marmot. Rather, King himself is listed as a collector in scientific literature. This example demonstrates how the seeing man passively reaches out and possesses knowledge without accrediting the progenitors of such knowledge. And this is a standard practice. If indigenous people bring you knowledge, if they bring you information about a particular species or about a new species, those indigenous people, while they may be mentioned initially, but when it works its way into scientific work or reports, these names disappear, thereby disappearing indigenous knowledge. So that by time we're looking at the early 20th century, there is relatively no information in the public historical record that indigenous people even contributed anything to Western European science or to Western European culture. To some extent, this is what this podcast is about, is saying, no, there was significant contribution, and we should be noting it. I think one of the problems that I come across sometimes when I'm looking at historical narratives and stuff like that is that when non-Indigenous people engage in a behavior that results in or injury of Indigenous people due to the behavior of the men of science, that it's not picked up in the literature. But if we look at King's narrative, There is one story, I think, that needs to be told because the story actually illustrates the motivations of these men of science from England. We'll leave a website at the bottom of the screen so that you can actually look at the incident yourself, because I'm only skimming it. It's actually worse than what I'm actually quoting here. So you can actually go and you can take a look yourself. From the middle to the latter end of November, starving parties of Indians were hourly arriving, whose sufferings were truly distressing and too plainly indicated by the screeching of the women and children. These were to be seen singly or in groups, standing by the men at their meals, eagerly watching each envied mouthful, and when refused, disdaining to utter a word of complaint. Severe trials, however, awaited them. Now, let me be very clear here. Captain Back was at Fort Resolution, and from what I can understand is they had two buildings. One was the one that they lived in, and the other one was for supplies. And Captain Back had all sorts of pemmican and other supplies in the other building. And this was for the expedition that would start in the spring. So that building was full of food. And we can see just what I've read so far that they obviously were not providing the food to indigenous people that actually required it. And we can think of what that motivation is well, Back is probably thinking, well, if I give them my food, then I won't be able to travel in the spring, and I won't become famous. Now remember, John Ross had already been found, so it wasn't as if Back was going to rescue anybody. It was about his own fame, or him and King's fame, and this idea of discovery that they were most concerned about, not whether or not the indigenous people around them were starving. The universal stillness was interrupted now and then by the arrival of a few emancipated Indians in search of provisions whose countenances, poor creatures, portrayed their extreme distress. The history of their suffering was extremely affecting. They finished their sad tale in a low voice with, "We have no meat," and in a still lower tone, "Not a particle of meat." And then, with a countenance brightening with hopeful anticipation, they exclaimed at the same time, pointing to our store, in as high a tone as their low condition would admit, "There is plenty of pemmican. Give us but little to save our lives." And a couple of handfuls of moldy pounded meat, which had been furnished by them to feed our dogs, was allotted to each, and they took their departure. A few miles distance, however, they lay scattered in the everlasting sleep, swept away apparently as suddenly as a row of sparrows by the discharge of a single gun. A few days afterwards, an Indian in a deceased state with his wife and 3 children arrived in so miserable a condition that they were mere skeletons. And in the evening of that same day, another Indian came in with 2 boys of the age of 10 and 14 years. The latter we soon got rid of, and on the 13th, the 2 women and 4 children were sent away. The diseased Indian was allotted to remain. In fact, his leg was so excoriated from the constant friction of his frozen robe against them that he literally could not move. He soon, however, recovered and followed, but not to join them, for out of that party of 9, not a soul escaped. Poor creatures, they lay stretched on the lake, far happier, let us hope, than the disconsolate being who was destined to witness so horrid a spectacle. And then King goes on to state, at the time, between 40 and 50 human beings lay dead around us, and so scattered that it was impossible to walk in any direction within 20 miles of the house without stumbling against a frozen body. So let's be clear here what happened. They had lots of food. They could have fed those First Nations people. A First Nations chief arrived, very early on when there was no food. He said, "Look, we will provide you all the food you need in the spring, but we need food now." And they denied that food. So is that genocide? I mean, what's going on here? That you're so concerned about your own popularity or your own legacy, that you will let other human beings die around you. I think it's absolutely appalling, and it's something, when we look at Canadian history, there are often stories like this that go unheard. It's absolutely disgusting, and I would hope that, someone picks up this narrative and does something about it, because it shows the true motivation of these men, their selfishness, their perception of Indigenous people. That it didn't matter if they died. What mattered is whether I become famous. Whether when I get home, that people look up to me as the great explorer. It's absolutely disgusting. By the time King was ready to embark back to England, we see that he had learned that collecting natural history specimens and the related information was a much more fruitful endeavor when you had the assistance of Indigenous people or those non-Indigenous people who had long tenure in the Mackenzie Zone. Success in the identification of natural history specimens and mapping information new to European science system had as much to do with your ability to communicate effectively with residents of the Mackenzie River District as it did with the actual collecting activities of the European collector. The next expedition that we're going to cover is what I would call the Captain Lefroy expedition of 1843 to 1845. 5 years after the Deason-Simpson expedition, another expedition was sent out to the Mackenzie River District. The British Association for the Advancement of Science, the Royal Society, the British government, and the Hudson's Bay Company came together in order to measure the variation in magnetic declination. What they know is that if you're using a compass, for example, that over time, because it points towards magnetic north changes a little bit every year, and you have to make the adjustments on maps. Okay, so this kind of information was really important during this period to kind of figure out, what those measurements differences were, so that you could make more accurate mapping. This expedition was led by a young artillery officer named John Henry Lefroy. Lefroy was appointed to the expedition by Edward Sabine, a member of the Royal Society, who was just completing the edit of Thomson-Simpson's narrative, the previous expedition's narrative, for the Hudson's Bay Company. Well, there was two narratives. There was the Dease narrative, but I don't think the Dease one was published until William Barr did in 2002, or at least not as comprehensive as what Barr did in 2002. The Royal Society contacted the Hudson's Bay Company, suggesting the undertaking of the expedition. The initial plan was to move from Montreal to York Factory by Hudson's Bay Fur Brigade boats and transportation to Moose Factory. So Moose Factory is in James Bay on the southern part of Hudson's Bay. While at Red River to repair some damaged instruments, and again, this idea, you have astronomical instruments and you're getting them repaired at Red River. And again, I just want to reiterate, this expedition was 1843, 1845, is that you could have scientific instruments repaired at Red River. George Simpson, the inland governor of the company, suggested that the expedition, to promote the objects of the survey, that they winter in the interior. Simpson arranged that the expedition, on return from Hudson's Bay, would join the Athabascan Fur Brigade and winter at Fort Chipewyan and proceed down the Mackenzie River in the spring to the Arctic Circle. So that would be in the same path that Alexander Mackenzie had taken. And I think the first Franklin expedition also went down the Mackenzie, or came back on the Mackenzie, I believe. At any rate, not only did Lefroy expedition help to maintain a strong connection between men of science in the Mackenzie River District, but it made significant contributions to imperial science. In terms of its objective to record magnetic variation, the expedition was a success. Stanley, 1955, states, quote, Edward Sabine made known to the Fellows of the Royal Society the broad lines of Lefroy's research, and Lefroy's measurements remained for many years the authority for the proximate position of the magnetic pole in North America. Stanley, 1955, goes on to quote Professor Lloyd, who had trained Lefroy at Trinity College, Dublin. Professor Lloyd states in 1874 that Lefroy's work was, quote, probably the most remarkable contribution to our knowledge of magnetic disturbance we possess. While Lefroy's accomplishments were significant, it is important to realize that much of what Lefroy did accomplish was a direct result of the relationship with company employees and Indigenous people. In Lefroy's letters home, he mentions meeting two young clerks who had come to be counted among the most important collectors in the Northwest. These men were Robert Campbell and Bernard Rogan Ross. Lefroy met Robert Campbell in 1844 at Fort Simpson. He refers to Campbell as, quote, exploring for the company, unquote, and describes him as a self-educated man raised from the ranks. It was Lefroy who, through written correspondence, introduced Robert Campbell to William Hooker, which I'm going to talk about a little later, who was a botanist in England, in 1848. Bernard Rogan Ross, who had become one of the most prodigious collectors in the HBC history, met Lefroy in Montreal. Ross had just been hired by the Hudson's Bay Company and was heading into the Northwest to take his first posting in 1843. So, I mean, if you look at Ross, Ross's first posting, he's in this canoe and fur brigade boats with Lefroy at the very beginning of his career. You know, someone like Ross, and as we will see in a later episode, he was involved in science, or I would say at many points, more involved in science than he was with the company. The company's business of the fur trade was second to importance to his work for science, and we'll see that in later podcasts. He would travel with Lefroy on the inland journey of his expedition. It is unknown whether Ross traveled as far as Fort Simpson, which was Lefroy's destination and where Ross would later become chief trader, as Ross' first posting was at Norway House. It is interesting to note that Lefroy describes Ross as being, quote, particularly allotted to me as a sort of assistant if I required his services. Lefroy would also train Hudson's Bay Company surgeon John Ray, who is is the most important non-Indigenous explorer during this historical period. And we'll be covering John Ray a lot more in the next episode. So he also taught John Ray astronomical survey techniques to prepare him for the Arctic searching expedition of 1847. One of the interesting things about Lefroy is I came across that he had written several letters to Florence Nightingale when she was in Korea. So after this expedition, Lefroy ends up in Crimea, and he ends up being stationed close to Florence Nightingale. And then he would write these, from what I could tell, was writing very consistently letters to Florence Nightingale in Crimea. And so I kind of wonder about that. Maybe there's some intrigue there. At any rate, Lefroy's interactions with First Nations people show much about culture in the contact zone at the time, or within the Mackenzie River zone. For example, he employs two Métis and a Six Nations person as voyageurs to aid him in the completion of his expedition. Lefroy also receives assistance from Indigenous people to fulfill some of his personal scientific objectives. These objectives included the study of Indigenous languages and the collecting of material culture and natural history specimens. Concerning Indigenous languages, Lefroy employed a woman by the name of Nanette as interpreter and a teacher of the Dene while in the Mackenzie River zone, as well as Chief Factor Lewis's Chief Factor, another fellow in the Northwest. His wife, a Métis woman named Jane Baladin, taught Lefroy the Cree language. Although Lefroy was mostly interested in collecting curiosities and souvenirs, he did attempt to collect scientific specimens as well. However, he found collecting scientific specimens difficult due to the amount of equipment he required for magnetic observation. Lefroy explains, and I quote, I left a cache at the Grand Rapid, 1 or 2 specimens of fossil fish, and the hope to add considerably on my return to my collection. But the storage of a single canoe so loaded as mine is very limited. A collection of skulls of animals would require a barge. Although there is no evidence to suggest that Lefroy sent back scientific collections, he was clearly aware of the importance of fossils and of animal skulls for zoological study and the study of botany through his acquaintance with men of science from England. He did have a collection, but he took that collection, like he went back to Toronto. He actually establishes a scientific observatory, an astronomical observatory in Toronto, and he also has his personal collection of grizzly bear necklaces, all this beautiful beadwork and such. Lefroy helped sustain the presence of imperial science in the Mackenzie River zone. He would have a significant effect on the collecting activities of later company officers, or as we can maybe call them, agents of science, such as Ross and Campbell, by providing them direct access to the international science system. Lefroy's presence would ensure that science remained at the forefront of the minds of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who resided in the Mackenzie River District. Thank you for watching this episode of Stolen Science. If you enjoyed watching, please consider subscribing and follow the link in the descriptions for further reading. Thank you.